In our final few chapters, we will be discussing the role of international trade, international economic development, and the impact of one of the biggest shocks to the overall economy in the 21st century. Before we begin, I would like to paint a picture of what I see as the problem with trade, trade deficits, and the weaknesses of the global supply chain. The issue is the scarcity of energy. Imagine, if you will, a machine that produces an abundance of 100% clean energy. The device is small enough to fit in your closet, and the machine can provide enough energy to power an entire neighborhood without the need for wires, transformers, or even electric meters. How would a device like that affect our dependence on international trade? No more dependency on oil, gas, diesel, hydroelectric dams, solar, wind, or even an electrical power grid. Fossil fuels will remain in the ground, thus removing the need for drilling, pipelines, and other polluting mining operations. Agricultural production can be done anywhere. With a surplus of energy, crops of all climate types can be produced in greenhouses anywhere in the world, thus eliminating the need for deforestation of the tropics and also eliminating dependence on the global supply chain for food security. The development of our electronic gadgets is highly dependent on rare earth minerals. China currently holds the monopoly of these minerals, as mining these minerals is very costly and very polluting. China needs oil, so the US provides oil in exchange for these rare earth metals. An abundant energy source would allow for an expansion of space exploration where rare earth minerals could be safely mined from nearby asteroids without the need for polluting our own planet. Now, you might think that the existence of such a device is science fiction, but such devices have been in use by our own military for decades, and there are several instances of independent inventors of such devices who have been bribed and or murdered in order to keep their inventions from reaching the market. As we stated in the previous lecture, both mainstream and monetarist economists would see such a game-changing invention as a threat to the global status quo of energy dependence and currency manipulation. In the short run, such a device would end the reign of the petrodollar, destabilize the current banking system, and would shift the balance of global power in unpredictable ways. However, if we sacrifice the long-run economic stability for short-run monetary stability, aren't we pushing ourselves forward to an unsustainable future just so that we can remain slaves to a global banking system? So now we move on to chapter 20. Like it or not, global trade is an integral part of the world economy that allows all nations access to goods and services they may not otherwise have access to. When trade is conducted in such a way that all sovereign rights, international law, and sovereign laws are being respected, international trade can provide for a free flow of goods and services that can provide prosperity for the entire world. That's generally not how it's done, but it is how it could be done. To begin with, the economic basis of trade is one of comparative advantage between different nations and regions of the world. For example, bananas, pineapples, and mangoes don't grow very well in the United States, so it makes sense to purchase these agricultural products from countries that have land-intensive resources and a tropical climate in order to grow these things. China doesn't have a lot of land, but it has a lot of people. Therefore, it makes sense that goods that require a great deal of labor-intensive resources would be purchased from China. The concept of comparative advantage is one that looks good on paper, but it breaks down when one side of the trade has significantly more leverage than the other. It would be nice if the world functioned the same way as the CPA and the house painter example on page 409 of your textbook does, but the world simply doesn't work that way. So let's look at the comparative advantage example on table 20.2 to illustrate how things work in the real world. At first glance, this example seems pretty straightforward. The terms of trade would be set up in order for both sides to have the greatest gain from trade based on the available trading possibilities line. The United States would give up some of its vegetable production in favor of beef production, and Mexico would give up some of its beef production in order to increase its vegetable production. In the end, both sides experience a gain from trade. Unfortunately, beef produces a lot of methane, which is a much more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So let's say that the United States passes a law prohibiting the expansion of beef production in order to reduce its impact on global warming. Vegetables, on the other hand, don't produce methane, but thousands of acres of rainforest need to be destroyed in order to turn the land into vegetable producing land. So let's say the Mexican government passes a law prohibiting the further destruction of rainforests in order to stop global warming. So is this trade deal dead? No, it isn't. And that's a problem. The problem with free trade, as it's described in the text, is that when nations create free trade agreements or treaties, they now have the freedom to bypass local laws in favor of providing businesses with the ability to experience gains from trade at the expense of the commons. For example, under the terms of the North Atlantic Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, if the United States and Mexico were faced with the dilemma described above, what they would do is they would hold a negotiation outside of the government's authority in order to hammer out a deal that discusses the cost of noncompliance with government regulations versus the gains that will be made by allowing the deal to go through. At this negotiation, they would discuss the ability each government has to enforce its respective bans on beef cattle limits, deforestation, and the respective fines that each would have to pay for being in violation of the law. If a government official is present, their role would be simply to negotiate the fees that each party would have to pay. In the end, a trade agreement will be reached. The governments of both nations will receive a payment in exchange for violating local laws, and the agreement itself supersedes any existing law in either country. So, if Greenpeace or any other environmental group wanted to sue either party for violating the law, the trade agreement would supersede local law and the case would be dropped. Another example of a free trade zone is the European Union. In 2017, voters in the United Kingdom decided they no longer wanted to be a part of the free trade zone in a referendum commonly referred to as Brexit. As of June 2020, all free trade agreements with the European continent were null and void. During the transition, there was a great deal of concern about how this would affect the UK's economy, considering that international trade is the largest share of that country's economy. So, to trade or not to trade? That is the question. The general problem with trade agreements, whether they are short-term or long-term, is that it's generally difficult to predict their impact on the local economy. After all, the world is a big place, and literally anything can happen thousands of miles away from a country, but the impact of a major event will be felt all over the world. Earthquakes, tsunamis, hurricanes, war, droughts, and political unrest in a small but important trading nation can affect supplies to several other countries all at once. When we throw in the impact of a global pandemic into the mix, combined with panic buying, then we end up with supply shortages on a global scale. The biggest vulnerability to global trade is the supply chain itself. The supply chain is a complex web of transportation infrastructures designed to transport goods from their point of production to their point of consumption. These include trucks, trains, ships, airplanes, automobiles, and even delivery drones. They also include roads, railways, shipping lanes, ports, and canals. An interruption in any one of these modes of transport threatens to grind the entire global trade system to a halt. In 2021, we experienced the most widespread supply chain interruptions since the Second World War. It was fueled by the global pandemic, but it also included changes in local environmental laws, a drop in the size of the labor force, along with drought, wildfires, and a jump in fuel prices, among other factors. Shipping. New COVID-19 guidelines state that if any crew member on a shipping vessel tests positive for COVID-19, the entire ship needs to remain at sea for at least 2 weeks, and it will be unable to dock until the entire crew tests negative. This has created a situation where large super container ships are left idle in the ocean while the shipping companies who own them go out of business, leaving their goods and their crews stranded. Lack of dock workers. New COVID-19 guidelines state that if a worker feels ill, they must not come to work and they must be tested. If they test positive, they must remain home for at least 2 weeks, and they may not only return to work if they test negative. This has created a severe labor shortage at the docks, causing delays in offloading. At this point, some of those rules are starting to relax, but the cultural impact that these rules are still being felt as all industries are experiencing a global labor shortage of workers who are willing to expose themselves to possible infection. Lack of trucks and drivers. New environmental laws passed in California have seriously depleted the number of available trucks to take the shipping containers from the docks to their next destinations. The law states that all trucks in California must be zero emission by 2030. The average useful life of a truck is 20 years, and at present there are no zero emission trucks available on the market. Therefore, truck fleets have been retiring their older vehicles and not replacing them because those new trucks will be illegal in less than 10 years. Additionally, California does not allow independent owner-operators of trucks in their state, as all drivers must work for a shipping company and all drivers must belong to a union. Shipping containers. For over 2 decades, there have been a severe trade imbalance with China where plenty of goods held in shipping containers are making their way in, but only 2/3 of the containers ever make it back out to China. Shipping companies are reluctant to fill their cargo ships with empty containers because they don't make any money moving them, and they also have a tendency to throw off the balance of the ship, making the return voyage more hazardous. For a while, China was a major importer of recyclables, and so U.S. ports would fill containers with empty glass, plastic, aluminum, paper, and steel, aka America's trash. Unfortunately, that market has also dried up because China now has enough of our trash to last them several lifetimes. So, on one side of the Pacific, the United States is struggling to find ways to repurpose and store literal mountains of shipping containers. And on the other side of the Pacific, China can't manufacture them fast enough to meet demand. With so many empty containers piling up at American ports, resources and labor are needed to manage the stockpile, which slows down the offloading and onloading process. Some of the supply chain woes were eased when Florida and Texas opened their ports to accept containers from ships that were stranded in the Pacific Ocean, but that meant that the ships either had to travel through the Panama Canal, or if the ship was too large to fit through the canal, they had to steam their way around the tip of South America, adding several weeks to their travel time and significantly increasing their costs. In March of 2021, a damaged shipping container in the Suez Canal blocked all shipping through that extremely important choke point for months, causing even further supply chain woes. What this clearly shows is how vulnerable the international trade can be due to supply chain interruptions, which makes us re-examine the commonly held belief that high dependence on global trade is a good thing or not.